The smell of walnut oil always reminded me of my father's hands. I stood in my workshop that Friday evening, running a block of fine grit sandpaper over the leg of a table nobody had asked me to finish. It was a commission from a family up in Weaverville, but I was in no hurry. There is no clock in a workshop. There is only the wood and what it is willing to become. Outside, the light was dying over Sugar Hollow, the way it does in late autumn gold, turning to rust, turning to gray. I could hear the creek below the ridge, and somewhere further off, a dog barking at nothing. My hands moved without me telling them to. 40 years of this work had taught my fingers to think for themselves. I am 67 years old. My name is Earl Whitman. Most folks in Asheville know me as the old man who fixes chairs and builds the occasional dining table. The fellow with sawdust on his boots and a workshop that smells like cedar and machine oil. They do not know that I own 6 furniture showrooms across 3 states, or that I hold the deed to more property in this county than I ever bothered to mention. I let them believe what they saw. A man who wears flannel and drives an old truck does not owe anyone an explanation for what he keeps in the bank. I set the sandpaper down and wiped my palms on my apron. My son Brett was getting married tomorrow. I had pressed my one good suit that morning, the charcoal one I bought for his mother's funeral, and hung it on the back of the workshop door where I could see it while I worked. I wanted to look right. I wanted, if I am honest with myself now, to look like a father worth having in the photographs. My phone was sitting on the workbench next to a jar of wood screws. It buzzed once, then again rattling against the tin. I picked it up with hands that still had grit under the nails. I put on my reading glasses, the ones Meg used to tease me about, and I read the message from my son. Dad, please do not come tomorrow. Tara says the workshop smell on your clothes and your hands will embarrass her family in front of everyone. Her father is a surgeon. Her mother sits on museum boards. They are not used to people like us. It is easier this way. I am sorry. I will send you pictures. I read it a second time, then a third. The words did not change no matter how many times I looked at them. People like us. As if I were a stain he needed to scrub off his shirt before the ceremony. The workshop was very quiet. I could hear the hum of the space heater in the corner and the tick of the old clock on the wall, the one Meg's father had given us as a wedding gift. I looked down at my hands. There was a white scar across my left knuckle from a table saw kickback in 1991. There was a permanent stain of walnut oil worked so deep into the creases that no soap had ever gotten it fully out. These hands had built the crib Brett slept in as a baby. These hands had built the desk where he did his homework, the bookshelf that held his college textbooks, the very chair he probably sat in the night he decided I was an embarrassment. I did not feel angry, not at first. I felt something colder settle into my chest, heavy and still, like a stone dropped into deep water. It is a particular kind of quiet that comes when a man realizes the thing he spent his whole life building was standing on a foundation that was never as solid as he believed. He did not call me. He did not come by the workshop and sit across from me the way men are supposed to when they have something hard to say. He sent a text message, the same way you might cancel a dinner reservation. I set the phone down on the bench, face down, the way you set down a tool you no longer trust yourself to hold steady. I walked to the small mirror by the sink where I washed sawdust off my hands each evening. I looked at the man staring back at me. Broad shoulders starting to stoop, gray stubble, eyes that had seen 40 years of other men's houses get built, while his own family quietly decided he was something to be managed rather than someone to be loved. I thought about calling him back. I thought about asking him how he could let another family talk about his own father that way, How he could sit there and let the word embarrass leave his mouth, about the man who put the roof over every place he had ever lived. But then I stopped myself because I already knew the answer, and I did not need to hear him stammer his way through it. If I had to beg my own son to want me at his wedding, then something had already been lost that no amount of begging would return. I walked over to the suit hanging on the door. I ran my hand down the sleeve, feeling the weight of the wool, remembering the tailor who had taken it in around the shoulders 3 years ago. It looked like a costume now. A costume for a role I had apparently been written out of. I took it off the hook. I carried it to the small closet in the corner of the workshop where I kept my coats, and I hung it in the very back, behind the winter canvas jacket I wore for hauling lumber. I would not be needing it tomorrow. I walked back to the workbench. My phone sat there, screen dark, waiting. There was a laptop underneath a stack of invoices near the window, the one I used for ordering supplies and checking the accounts for the showrooms nobody in my family had ever bothered to ask about. I wiped my hands clean one more time. I sat down. I opened the laptop, and the screen came alive with a pale blue light that filled the dark workshop. They did not know who I really was. They were about to find out. The laptop hummed to life, and the glow of it fell across my hands like moonlight on water. I logged into the account I used for the family holdings, the one Brett thought was just a small retirement fund I dabbled in. I typed slowly. My fingers are better with a chisel than a keyboard, but I have never needed to be fast at this. I only needed to be certain. I pulled up the transaction history first, the way a man checks a wound before deciding how deep it goes. The venue for tomorrow was a place called Ravenswood Estate, an old plantation house on the east side of the county that Tara's mother had insisted on because it photographed well for the wedding magazines. I had wired the deposit and the final balance 3 weeks ago. $42,000. I had told myself it was a gift, that a father pays for his son's happiness and does not ask for a seat at the table in return. I scrolled further down. $6,000 at a spa for Tara and her mother dated 2 days ago. $9,000 for a florist who specialized in imported peonies out of season. A car service reserved for tomorrow morning to collect Tara's parents from the airport, first-class seats, already paid out of an account that still had my name stamped on every line. I sat back in my chair. The space heater ticked in the corner. Somewhere out past the window, an owl called once and went quiet. I thought about the family business arrangement Brett had asked me to sign 3 months earlier. The one he called a partnership, and I now understood to be something closer to a trap. He and Tara had drawn up papers folding my workshop, my house on the ridge, and 2 of my rental properties into something they named Whitman Family Holdings, LLC. They told me it was for tax purposes. They told me it would protect the family legacy. What they had not told me was that the paperwork, buried on page 14, gave the managing partner, meaning Brett, the authority to sell, borrow against, or transfer any asset in the trust without my signature, so long as a doctor had signed off that I was no longer, in the words of the document, fully capable of managing my own affairs. I had not signed it yet. I had told him I wanted my lawyer to look it over first. But 3 weeks ago, Brett had also asked me almost in passing to see my regular doctor for what he called a routine checkup. He had even offered to drive me. I had thought it was kindness at the time. Now, sitting in my workshop with the transaction history glowing in front of me, I understood it for what it likely was. A first step toward proving, on paper, that the old man in the workshop was no longer fit to hold the keys to his own life. I picked up my phone and called Gus Marino. He answered on the second ring, his voice thick with the tail end of dinner. "Earl," he said, "big day tomorrow. You nervous?" "I am not going to the wedding, Gus," I said. There was a pause on the line, the kind that told me he had set down his fork. I told him about the text message. I read it to him, word for word, while I stared at the empty hook on the back of the door where my suit used to hang. Gus did not interrupt. He had known me for 30 years, and he knew when a man needed to finish talking before anyone offered him advice. When I was done, he asked what I wanted to do. I told him about the doctor's appointment Brett had arranged, almost in passing, 3 weeks earlier. I heard him go very still. "Earl," he said, his voice careful now. "That clause on page 14. If they had gotten a doctor to sign off on incapacity, and if you had signed that agreement, Brett could have moved every asset in that trust without your consent. The workshop, the house, all of it." "I know," I said. "I did not sign it." "Thank God for that," he said. "I want you to do 3 things tonight," I told him. "Draft a formal revocation of any power of attorney Brett currently holds over the rental accounts. Freeze the Whitman family holdings paperwork so nothing can be filed without my signature in person. And prepare a 30-day notice on the house at Montford Street." Gus exhaled slowly. "That is the house they are living in." "That is my house," I said. "They pay me $1,100 a month for a place worth 3 times that, and I have made up the difference myself for 3 years because I wanted them to have a good start. That ends tonight. There is also a credit card in Brett's name attached to my business account. I am locking it myself, so there is no confusion in the morning about whether it was declined by accident." "Earl," Gus said, his voice softening. "Are you sure? He is still your son." "I raised him alone after Meg passed," I said. "I taught him how to work with his hands, how to keep his word, how to treat people who serve him coffee the same way he treats people who sign his paychecks. Somewhere along the way, he decided none of that mattered as much as what his wife's family thought of him. I am not punishing him, Gus. I am done paying for a version of my son that does not respect the man who built him." "All right," he finally said. "I will have the papers ready by morning." I hung up the phone. I opened the banking application and found the card ending in the 4 numbers I knew by heart. The one I had given Brett 2 years ago so he would never have to worry about being caught short in front of people he wanted to impress. I pressed the button that said, "Report lost or stolen." A confirmation window appeared asking if I wanted to order a replacement. I clicked no. I closed the laptop. The workshop went dark again, except for the single bulb over my workbench, swinging slightly from a draft I could not place. I sat there for a long while, listening to the old clock tick on the wall, thinking about a little boy who used to follow me around this same room with a toy hammer, asking me to teach him how to build something that would last. Tomorrow was going to be a very bad day for Brett Whitman. And for the first time since I had read that text message, some small, tired part of me was almost sorry for what he was about to learn. The sun was just clearing the ridgeline when I walked out to the woodpile behind my house, an axe in my hand, and a thermos of black coffee steaming on the porch rail. It was 7 in the morning on the day my son was supposed to get married. Most fathers would be tying a tie or checking their watch, thinking about the toast they were going to give. I was splitting kindling because a man's hands need something honest to do when his heart is doing something else. I set a round of oak on the block and swung. The crack of it echoed off the hillside, sharp and clean, the kind of sound that has always steadied me. I split another and another. I could smell the coffee and the cold morning air and the faint sweetness of the wood dust settling on my boots. This was who I was. I built things. I fixed things. And today, I was going to take some things back. I was reaching for the next round when I heard the tires. It was not a sound this road was used to, a high-pitched screech of expensive rubber trying to stop too fast on gravel it was never built for. I did not look up right away. I knew the sound of that engine. It was Brett's Audi, the one I had bought outright 2 years ago when he told me he needed something reliable for client meetings. The car came around the bend too fast and slid to a stop at the base of my driveway, throwing a spray of loose stone against the fence. I set the axe down against the block. I let it stand there upright, the head buried in the wood. Then I waited. The driver's door flew open first. Brett scrambled out, looking like a man who had not slept, hair sticking up, wearing a wrinkled undershirt and gym shorts, instead of the tuxedo that should have already been on his back. He looked nothing like a groom. He looked like a boy who had lost something at a grocery store and could not find his way back to the register. The passenger door opened next. Tara stepped out in a silk robe over what I assumed was very expensive underwear. Sunglasses covering half her face, even though the sun had barely cleared the trees. She slammed the door hard enough that the whole car rocked on its frame. You do not slam the door on a car you never paid for. I thought, but I did not say it. Not yet. Earl, Tara called out, her voice already sharp enough to cut. "What is wrong with you?" I picked up the thermos and took a slow sip of coffee before I answered. "I am splitting wood," I said. "I like to focus when I work." Brett came jogging up the driveway, his loafers slipping on the wet grass. "Dad," he said, breathing hard. "Dad, my card is not working. Tara's card is not working. We have vendors calling. The florist needs the final payment in an hour. Why is the account frozen? What did you do?" I looked at him the way I might look at a board with a hidden knot in it, something I needed to study before I decided how to cut it. "I locked the accounts," I said, "and I revoked the LLC paperwork. And Gus is filing a 30-day notice on the Montford house this morning." Tara pulled her sunglasses down just far enough to look at me over the rims. "You are joking," she said. "I have never been more serious in my life," I said. She let out a short, disbelieving laugh and turned to Brett. "I told you," she said. "I told you something was wrong with him. Look at him, Brett. He is standing there in a flannel shirt covered in sawdust like some kind of hillbilly splitting logs, while my parents are about to land at the airport, expecting a car and a hotel suite that is apparently not paid for anymore." I did not flinch. I have been called worse by better men on job sites than this girl, standing in my driveway in her bathrobe. "You want to know something, Earl?" She went on, stepping closer, her voice climbing. "You have always been an embarrassment to this family. You smell like a lumber yard. You dress like you cannot afford better. My family flew in from Boston expecting to meet a respectable man, and instead they are going to find out the groom's father chops wood in his front yard at dawn like some kind of hired hand. That is exactly what you are, isn't it? The help. The old man who writes checks and stays out of the photographs." The words landed the way a nail gun misfires, sudden and sharp, but they did not do what she thought they would do. They did not break me. They clarified something I had already decided the night before. I looked at Brett. He would not meet my eyes. He was staring at the gravel, his jaw working, saying nothing to defend the man who had built the desk he did his homework on. The man who had paid for the very car he had just driven up my driveway in. "Is that what you think I am too, Brett?" I asked. "The help?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came out. I picked the axe back up off the block. I did not raise it. I simply held it the way a man holds a tool he trusts. And I looked at the two of them standing in my driveway in their expensive borrowed lives. "You are going to need that car to get to the airport," I said, nodding toward the Audi. "Which is a shame, because as of this morning, it is not yours to drive." "What do you mean it is not ours to drive?" Brett said, his voice cracking somewhere between anger and panic. "That is my car, Dad. You gave it to me." "I gave you the money for it," I said. "I put the title in my own name for insurance purposes, same as I do with every vehicle I finance. You have been driving it. That is not the same thing as owning it." Tara crossed her arms over her robe, her jaw tight. "Unbelievable," she said. "He is actually going to do this? On the wedding day? I walked past both of them down the driveway, toward the Audi still idling where Brett had left it. The morning air smelled like wet gravel and cut wood. I ran my hand along the hood as I passed. The metal was still warm from the drive over. "Dad, wait," Brett said, hurrying after me. "Please, we have to pick up her parents. We have an hour before the ceremony. You cannot do this to us right now." "I am not doing anything to you," I said. "I am simply not doing something for you anymore. There is a difference, and it took me 67 years to learn it." I reached into my jacket pocket and found the spare key I kept for every vehicle registered under my name, a habit 30 years in the furniture business had taught me never to break. I pressed the button. The lights on the Audi flashed once, and the locks released with a soft click that sounded in that quiet driveway almost like a verdict. "Dad, no," Brett said again, his voice rising into something closer to a plea now. "Please, not the car. We will figure out the money later, I swear. Just let us have the car." I opened the driver's side door. The leather was still warm from where he had been sitting an hour ago. It smelled like his cologne, something expensive and forgettable. The kind of scent that costs more because of the bottle than what is inside it. "You know," I said, glancing back at him, "I worked 6 extra months of side jobs to pay cash for this car, so you would never have a payment hanging over your head. I wanted you to walk into a room and feel like you had already made it. I never once thought I would be the reason you felt like you had to stand up straighter than you actually were." Tara came stalking down the driveway behind him, her bare feet slapping against the wet stone. "Get away from that car," she snapped. "That is our car. You cannot just take it because you are having some kind of episode." "I am not having an episode, Tara," I said. "I am having a very clear morning for the first time in a long while." I lowered myself into the driver's seat. The seat adjusted differently than my truck, softer, lower, built for a man who had never spent a day of his life on a job site. I set my coffee thermos in the cup holder, an old habit, out of place in a car this expensive, and found it strangely satisfying to see it sitting there. "Dad," Brett said, gripping the top of the open door with both hands, his knuckles going white. "Please, we need that car. We have to get to the venue. We have to get her parents from the airport. You cannot leave us stranded like this. What are people going to think?" I looked up at him from the driver's seat, at the boy I had raised alone after his mother passed. The boy who used to fall asleep in the workshop with sawdust in his hair while I finished a job by lamplight so we would have enough for groceries that week. "I do not much care what people think anymore, Brett," I said. I spent a long time caring what people thought, and it got me a text message telling me I was too embarrassing to attend my own son's wedding. I am done paying for that particular kind of opinion. I found the ignition button on the dash under my thumb after 40 years of turning a key. I pressed it. The engine woke with a low, expensive hum. Nothing like the honest growl of my old truck, but it started all the same. The dashboard lit up in soft blue light, the same color the laptop screen had been the night before, and for a moment I sat there feeling the vibration of it through the seat, thinking about how strange it was that a machine built to impress strangers could feel so hollow underneath a man's hands. Tara was screaming something behind me, her voice climbing into a register I had only ever heard from women on job sites who had just watched a contractor walk off with their deposit. Brett was still holding the door, still saying please, still saying Dad, but I was no longer listening to the words themselves. I was listening to the sound underneath them, the sound of two people realizing for the first time that morning that the ground beneath their feet had never actually belonged to them. I put my hand on the gear shift. I shifted the car into reverse and eased my foot onto the gas. Brett stumbled back from the door as it swung shut against his hip, more startled than hurt. I backed down the driveway, slow and steady, the way I have always driven, no matter what was sitting under the hood. In the mirror, I watched them both standing there in the gravel. Tara with her hands pressed over her mouth. Brett just standing with his arms hanging at his sides, looking smaller than I had seen him look since he was maybe 8 years old and had lost his mother's hand in a crowded grocery store. I pulled onto the county road and drove the long way around, past the split-rail fences and the sugar maples just starting to turn, until I reached my own garage at the workshop. I pulled the Audi inside and closed the door behind it. The engine ticked as it cooled in the dark. I sat there a moment longer than I needed to, my hands still on the wheel, feeling the strange quiet of a car that had never once been mine to feel proud of. I went back into the workshop and poured myself a second cup of coffee. My hands were steady, but there was a tremor underneath them. Somewhere. Not fear, just the current of a man who has fired the first real shot of a war he never wanted to start. I sat down at my workbench and pulled the laptop toward me again. There was one more piece of business from the night before that needed finishing in daylight. Something I had asked Gus to prepare but had not yet made official myself. The house on Montford Street had been my gift to them 3 years ago. A narrow 2-story with a wraparound porch that I had restored myself. Sanding the floors, rebuilding the staircase, hanging every door so it closed without a sound. I had told Brett it was a starter home, something to build a life in before they were ready for something bigger. What I had not told him, what I had never needed to tell him, was that I still held the deed, and that the $1,100 they paid me each month was less than half of what the market would have asked from anyone else. I opened my email and found the message Gus had drafted overnight, waiting in my drafts folder, for a final word from me before it went out. I read it once. Notice of lease termination effective in 30 days for the property at 417 Montford Street. I added one line beneath Gus's signature, block my own, plain and direct. This was never about the wedding. This was about respect. I hope you find some, wherever you land next. I pressed send. I sat back and looked around my workshop at the half-finished table, still waiting for its final coat. At the old clock on the wall ticking toward 8:15. I thought about Meg, the way she used to stand in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee and tell me not to work too hard on a Saturday. She would have hated what I was doing this morning. She would have also understood exactly why I was doing it. The house phone on the wall rang, the old rotary-style one. I had never bothered to replace the number only a handful of people still had. I almost let it go, the way I had let so many calls go the night before, but something made me pick it up. Bernard Whitman, I said. Mr. Whitman, this is Deputy Collins with the County Sheriff's Office. I am calling to confirm we received the property management filing for a lockout at 417 Montford Street. We have a locksmith scheduled to meet your property manager there in 20 minutes to change the locks per the eviction notice. Just want to confirm you are aware and in agreement. I am aware, I said. Go ahead and proceed. Understood, sir. Also wanted to flag, our dispatcher noted the tenants of record may currently be en route to that address, based on a call that came through a few minutes ago. If there is any concern about a confrontation, we can have a deputy stand by. I looked out the workshop window at the ridgeline, at the gold light spreading slow across the valley, the way it does on a clear autumn morning. The kind of light that makes a man forget for just a moment that anything in his life has gone wrong at all. That will not be necessary, I said. But thank you for the call. I hung the phone back on its cradle. I picked my truck keys up off the hook by the door, the same hook where my suit had hung the night before, and I stood there for a second, feeling the weight of them in my palm. If Brett and Tara were headed to Montford Street right now, hoping I had been bluffing, hoping the key still turned in that lock, they were about to learn the same lesson the Audi had already taught them an hour ago. Nothing they thought belonged to them had ever really been theirs. I grabbed my jacket off the peg and walked out to my truck. The drive to Montford Street took 18 minutes, past the old cotton mill converted into lofts, and the coffee shop that used to be a hardware store where I bought my first real set of chisels 40 years ago. Asheville changes slow in some places and fast in others, and that road has always shown me both at once. I saw them before I even parked. Brett and Tara were standing on the front porch of the house I had restored with my own hands, and a man in a gray uniform shirt was just backing away from the door, a drill case in his hand. Tara was pounding on the wood with the flat of her palm, screaming something at a door that could not hear her. Brett stood a few feet back, pacing the walkway in his wrinkled undershirt, phone pressed to his ear, getting no answer from whoever he was calling. I pulled my truck to the curb and killed the engine. I did not slam the door. I pushed it shut until it clicked the way I always do, and that small sound was enough to make Brett's head snap up. When he saw me, something changed in his face. The fear from earlier that morning was gone, replaced by something rawer, uglier. He was not looking at his father anymore. He was looking at the man standing between him and the life he believed he was owed. "You did this," he said, coming down off the porch steps fast. "You actually did this." "Dad, our clothes are in there. Her dress for the reception is in there. Our passports. You cannot lock us out of our own house." "It has never been your house, Brett," I said, keeping my voice level. "It has always been mine. The lease was month to month in my name, and I ended it last night. There was a notice posted right there on that door. Did you not read it?" "I do not care about a piece of paper," he shouted, stepping closer, his fists opening and closing at his sides. "Open the door, Dad. Open it right now, or I swear to God I will." I stood my ground. I have stood my ground on job sites against men twice his size when a subcontractor tried to walk off without finishing what he started. And I was not about to move for my own son throwing a tantrum in a driveway. "You will," what I asked. My voice quiet now, quieter than his. "You will put your hands on me. Go ahead and try it, son. But you should remember who taught you how to work with your hands in the first place. And you should remember that I have 40 years of hard labor sitting in these shoulders that you have never once had to earn for yourself." He froze. Something in his eyes flickered, some old childhood instinct that told him the ground had just shifted under him again. And he took a step back instead of forward. Tara came storming down the porch steps behind him, her robe flapping loose, her bare feet slapping against the cold concrete. "Brett, stop talking to him," she snapped. "He has lost his mind. We need to call someone." "Call who?" I asked. "The police." "Go ahead. Tell them the man who owns this house locked the door on tenants who broke their lease and stole a car that was never theirs to begin with." I would love to hear how that conversation goes. She turned on me then, her mascara starting to run at the corners of her eyes, her voice climbing into a register I had heard from difficult clients over the years, the kind of voice that expects the world to rearrange itself around its volume. "You selfish old man," she said. "Do you have any idea what you are doing to us? My parents are in a car right now on their way from the airport. They are expecting a suite at the Grove Park Inn. They are expecting a wedding. And you are out here playing landlord because your feelings got hurt over one text message." I looked at her for a long moment, at the desperation dressed up as outrage, and I felt something in my chest go very still and very clear. "Speaking of your parents," I said, reaching into my jacket for my phone, "I should probably let the car service know their trip just got a lot shorter." I pulled up the contact I had saved 2 weeks earlier, back when I still believed I was simply paying for my son's happiness. Prestige Transportation, Asheville Regional Airport pickup, scheduled for a black town car and a driver holding a sign with the Ashford name on it. Tara's face went white before I had even finished dialing. "You would not," she whispered. I pressed the call button and held the phone to my ear, watching her eyes track the screen the whole time. Watching her realize in real time exactly how much of her perfect morning still belonged to a man she had just called selfish. The line rang twice before it picked up. "Wade," I said, keeping my eyes on Tara the whole time. "It is Earl." "Earl, good to hear from you." A warm voice boomed through the speaker, loud enough that Tara could hear every word. Everything's set for the airport run. My driver should be pulling up to arrivals in about 10 minutes. There has been a change of plans, Wade, I said. I need you to cancel that pickup. Cancel it. There was a pause, the sound of paper shuffling somewhere on his end. Earl, the flight already landed 20 minutes ago. My driver is standing there right now with a sign. I know, I said. Send him home. I will cover whatever cancellation fee you need to charge. Put it on my account, but do not let him pick up those passengers. Is everything all right? Wade asked, his voice dropping into something more careful. Everything is fine, I said. The family arrangement changed this morning. I am withdrawing my authorization on that reservation, effective right now. All right, Earl, he said slowly. You are the boss. I will radio him to head back. I hung up the phone. The silence that followed was different from the one before the call, heavier somehow. The kind of silence that comes after something has already broken, rather than before. Tara made a sound I had never heard a grown woman make. Something between a gasp and a sob, both hands flying up to cover her mouth. You did not just do that, she said, her voice muffled behind her fingers. You did not just strand my parents at the airport. I did, I said. They are welcome to call a car themselves. I hear the airport has a perfectly good taxi line, or there is a shuttle that runs downtown every 20 minutes. Very affordable, very practical. My parents do not take shuttles. She screamed the words tearing out of her raw and ugly. They are going to be standing on a curb like they are homeless. They are going to hate me. They are going to hate this whole family. They do not even know me, I said. And judging by everything you have told me about how this family sees me, I imagine they already do not think much of me at all. So I have not lost anything I had to begin with. Brett stood there staring at me, his face gone the color of old drywall. Dad, he said, his voice barely above a whisper now. How could you do this? They are guests. This is humiliating. Humiliating. I repeated, letting the words sit in the cold morning air between us. Humiliating is standing in your own workshop last night, polishing your shoes for a wedding you were told not to attend. Humiliating is finding out your son is ashamed of the hands that built every roof he has ever slept under. This is not humiliation, Brett. This is education. You are destroying my life to teach me a lesson, he shouted, his voice cracking somewhere in the middle of the sentence. I am not destroying anything I said. I am simply done financing a version of this family that has no room for me in it. Tara had stopped screaming. She stood very still now, smoothing the front of her robe with shaking hands, her face gone cold and calculating, in a way that frightened me more than her shouting had. Fine, she said. You want to play it this way, Earl Fine? We do not need you. We have the house. We have the wedding gifts already sitting inside. We will figure this out, and when we do, you will never see us again. You will die alone in that little workshop, and nobody will care. I smiled at her then, a tired, genuine smile that seemed to unsettle her more than anything I had said all morning. About the house, I said. You might want to reconsider that plan. Why, she snapped, though. Something in her voice had already started to waver. Because that door you were pounding on 10 minutes ago has a brand new lock on it, I said. And I am the only one standing here who owns a key. Brett's hands dropped to his sides. He looked at the porch, at the door, at the small brass plate on the frame where the locksmith had just finished his work, and I watched the last piece of his morning collapse in real time. You evicted us, he said quietly. You actually evicted us. I did not evict you, I said. I stopped providing housing for people who do not consider me family. You said it yourself this morning. I am the help. Well, the help just quit. They stood there a long moment, neither of them speaking, the wind picking up dry leaves along the gutter and scattering them across the walkway. Then Tara grabbed Brett's arm and pulled him toward the street, muttering something about finding a car, finding a phone, finding anyone who could still fix the disaster their morning had become. I watched them go until they turned the corner and disappeared past the old sycamore trees. Then I walked up the porch steps, pulled the new key from my pocket, and let myself into the house I had built for them with my own 2 hands. The smell hit me first. A thick, stale mixture of old takeout spilled wine and the kind of neglect that settles into a house when nobody bothers to open a window. I stood in the entryway for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through drawn blinds, and felt something in my chest tighten before I had even seen the damage. I flipped the switch by the door. The overhead light buzzed on, and the room came into focus around me. It was not that the house had been destroyed in some fit of anger. It was worse than that. It had been treated with a kind of casual, ongoing disrespect that felt almost more painful than outright destruction would have. Designer coats were draped over the backs of dining chairs I had built by hand. Shoeboxes were stacked in leaning towers against the wall I had painted the summer they moved in. Takeout containers littered the coffee table, a few of them still buzzing faintly with fruit flies. A crystal glass lay shattered near the fireplace, and nobody had bothered to sweep it up. I walked further into the room, my boots crunching against something on the hardwood. I looked down. A broken champagne flute ground into fine crystal dust against the floor I had sanded and finished myself 3 years ago. This was how they lived, I thought. Not like a young couple building a life together, but like squatters passing through someone else's palace, waiting for the next thing to be handed to them. I walked into the kitchen. The sink was stacked with dishes gone crusty at the edges. An open bottle of champagne sat on the counter, gone flat and warm in the morning heat. I looked at the granite countertop I had installed myself, now ringed with water stains and the pale scorch mark of a pan set down without a trivet. I felt something cold rising in my chest, a fury that had nothing to do with mess and everything to do with what the mess represented. But then I turned back toward the living room, and the mess stopped mattering entirely. I was looking at the wall above the fireplace, the long, empty stretch of plaster where a large watercolor should have been hanging. The one Meg had painted of the lake cabin we used to rent every summer before Brett was born. I had given it to him 3 years ago when he moved in, told him it belonged somewhere he would see it every day, somewhere it could remind him where he came from. The wall was bare. A faint rectangular shadow marked where the frame used to sit. The paint around it slightly duller than the rest, sun faded over 3 years of hanging in that exact spot. My heart started to beat harder in my chest, a slow, heavy thud that had nothing to do with exertion. I walked to the hallway. There had been a smaller painting there, too, a study of wildflowers along the Blue Ridge Parkway that Meg had done the spring before she got sick. The colors soft and hopeful in a way that used to make visitors stop and ask who the artist was. Gone. Another pale rectangle on the wall. Another set of naked picture hooks staring back at me like something accusing. I moved faster now, my boots louder against the floor than I intended, my breath coming shorter than it should have for a man simply walking through a house. I checked the small study off the hallway, the room where I had hung the third piece, a self-portrait Meg had painted for our 25th anniversary. The one where she was smiling, that quiet, private smile she only ever gave to me. That wall was bare too. I stood there in the center of the room, turning in a slow circle, taking in every empty space where a piece of my wife used to hang. 3 paintings. 3 pieces of a woman who had been gone 5 years now. Pieces I had trusted my own son to keep safe in the home I had built for him. I thought of every excuse I had ever made for Brett over the years. He is young. He is finding his way. He is under pressure from a world that is harder than the one I grew up in. Meg used to say the same things when he was a teenager, testing every boundary he could find. Let him make his mistakes, Earl, she would tell me. He will find his way back to who he really is. But mistakes do not empty 3 walls of a mother's paintings. Mistakes do not leave naked hooks behind like open wounds. I stood very still in that quiet, wrecked living room, listening to my own pulse in my ears. And I understood with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its coldness, that whatever this was, it was no longer something a father could forgive with a stern conversation and a second chance. I needed to know where those paintings had gone. And some part of me, the part that had built things with these hands for 40 years and always trusted its own instincts, already knew the answer would not be one I wanted to find. I walked toward the dining room on legs that did not feel entirely my own. The table in there had been the first thing I ever gave them when they moved in, a long walnut piece I had built with my own hands 40 years earlier as a wedding gift for Meg, back when we were young and broke and I worked nights just to afford the lumber. She had eaten breakfast at that table every morning of our marriage. I had given it to Brett 3 years ago and told him, half joking, that it had outlasted better men than either of us, and it would probably outlast him, too. The dining room was empty. Not the chairs, not the rug, just the space where the table should have stood. A clean rectangle of unfaded hardwood, surrounded by a border of sun-bleached floor that told me exactly how long it had been sitting there before it disappeared. I stood in that empty rectangle and felt something inside me go very quiet, the way a job site goes quiet right after the crew realizes a beam has failed, and nobody wants to be the one to say it out loud first. I moved down the hallway to the bedroom, my hands not quite steady anymore. Meg's small jewelry box sat on the dresser where it always had, the one I had built her from a scrap of cherry wood the year Brett was born. I lifted the lid. Empty. Her jade bracelet, the one her own mother had given her, the one she wore every day until the chemotherapy made her wrists too thin for it to sit right. Gone. Beside the jewelry box, a glass display case that used to hold my father's chisel set, a dozen hand-forged blades passed down through 3 generations of Whitman men, tools older than the state of North Carolina's modern roads. The case sat open, empty. I sat down slowly on the edge of the unmade bed, my knees no longer entirely willing to hold me up. They had not just been living off me. They had been selling me, piece by piece, one memory at a time. I do not know how long I sat there before I noticed the small metal trash can beside the nightstand, overflowing with crumpled receipts and takeout napkins. I reached in without really deciding, to the way your hand sometimes moves before your mind has caught up with what it is looking for. I pulled out a fistful of paper, pizza receipts, a parking ticket, and then, near the bottom, a small square of yellow carbon paper, crumpled into a tight ball, as if someone had wanted it gone, but had not quite managed to throw it far enough away. I smoothed it out on my knee, with hands that had gone strangely cold. The letterhead at the top read, Blue Ridge Pawn and Loan, with a small printed logo of a mountain range beneath it. Beneath that, a list written in a clerk's cramped handwriting. Item 1, watercolor painting, lake landscape. Item 2, watercolor painting, floral study. Item 3, watercolor painting, portrait. Item 4, antique wood carving, chisel set, 12 pieces. Item 5, jade bracelet. I stared at the total printed at the bottom of the slip. $950. $950. That was the number some clerk behind a counter had written down for 40 years of my wife's paintbrush for my father's hands, passed down through 3 generations for the last physical piece of jade that had ever touched Meg's skin. I do not know how long I sat there holding that slip of paper before something inside me finally shifted from grief into something else entirely, something colder and far more settled. It was not rage. Not exactly. Rage burns hot and dies fast. This was different. This felt like the moment a board finally splits clean down a grain line you have been watching for years. Quiet and total and impossible to put back together. This was not a wedding dispute anymore. This was not even about a text message or a locked door or a car that never should have been driven in the first place. This was theft. Plain and simple. The kind any judge in this county would recognize the moment I laid the evidence on the table in front of them. I folded the receipt carefully along its original creases and slid it into the breast pocket of my flannel shirt, right over my heart, the way a man carries something he intends to use. I stood up. My knees held steady this time. I walked back through that ransacked house, past the empty walls, past the empty rectangle where a 40-year-old table used to stand. And I pulled out my phone to call the one person in this county who could turn a piece of yellow paper into a warrant. I walked out to my truck and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. The pawn slip still folded in my breast pocket, warm now from being so close to my chest. I found Gus's name in my contacts and pressed call. But before it connected, my mind slipped backward, the way it sometimes does when grief finds a fresh wound to pour itself into. I remembered the night I gave Meg that bracelet. It was our 10th anniversary, and I had spent 2 months of overtime framing houses out past Hendersonville to afford it a thin band of jade set in silver that the jeweler downtown had told me came from a source he trusted, though I never much cared where jade came from, as long as it made her smile the way it did. We were sitting on the floor of our first real apartment because we still could not afford a proper dining set, eating takeout out of paper cartons, and she had cried when I clasped it around her wrist. She wore it every day after that, through 2 pregnancies, through the lean years when the business almost folded, through every job site cookout and church potluck and quiet Sunday morning for the next 30 years. Near the end, when the treatments had made her so thin the bracelet slid loose on her wrist, she had taken it off herself and pressed it into my palm. "Give this to Brett's wife one day," she had told me, her voice barely above a whisper by then. "Make sure she understands what it means." I had given it to Tara at their engagement dinner 8 months ago. I had told her the whole story, watched her nod along with what I believed at the time was genuine feeling. She had sold it for a fraction of what it was worth to help pay for centerpieces that would be wilted and thrown away before the reception even ended. The line connected. Gus answered on the first ring, sounding like a man who had been waiting by the phone all morning. "Earl," he said. "Talk to me." "I am at Montford Street," I said. I got in. I found what I needed to find. "What did you find?" he asked. "I found the receipt," I said. "Blue Ridge Pawn and Loan. They sold Meg's paintings. They sold her jade bracelet. They sold my father's chisels. $950, Gus. That is the number some kid behind a counter wrote down for 40 years of my life." There was a long silence on the other end. Then Gus exhaled, slow and heavy. "Earl, I am sorry," he said. "I am truly sorry." "Do not be sorry," I said. "Be useful. I want a criminal complaint drafted today. Grand larceny, theft of property. I have the pawn slip in my pocket right now, dated yesterday with what I have to assume is Brett's signature on the intake form." "Earl, I have not seen you like this since your father passed," he said carefully. "This is your son we are talking about. Once we file, the district attorney takes it from there. There is no taking it back." "I know exactly what I am asking for," I said. "He sold his mother for $950, Gus. He made his choice this morning when he decided a stranger's flower arrangement mattered more than the woman who raised him. Now I am making mine." I heard him breathing on the other end, the particular sound of a man weighing 30 years of friendship against the plain letter of the law. "All right," he finally said, his voice steady again. "I will start the paperwork. Anything else?" "One more thing," I said. "Pull the LLC documents. Page 14. The clawback clause we drafted 5 years ago. Back when I first started to worry, Brett did not understand the weight of a dollar. If any portion of that theft can be tied to funds or property originating from the family trust, I want it activated. I want everything traced. Earl, that clause is a nuclear option, Gus said quietly. It could freeze every account he touches. The car, the clothes, everything. I know exactly what it does, I said. I wrote it myself. I hung up the phone and sat there in the quiet cab of my truck, listening to the engine tick as it cooled, feeling something settle into place inside me that I had been holding at bay since the night before. It was not anger anymore. It had passed through anger sometime in that empty dining room and come out the other side as something colder and far more permanent. The particular kind of clarity a man feels when the last thread connecting him to an old version of his life has finally, quietly snapped. My phone buzzed once against the seat. I looked down. Brett. I let it ring twice before I answered. Not out of cruelty, just because some part of me needed those 2 extra seconds to decide who I was going to be on this call. Dad, Brett said the moment I picked up his voice, already unraveling at the edges. Dad, thank God, everything is falling apart. Her parents are stuck at the airport and will not stop calling. The coordinator at Ravenswood says the final incidentals authorization on file got declined this morning, and she needs a new card in the next hour, or she is pulling the bar service and the extra catering staff. I do not have another card, Dad. You froze everything. Please, you have to fix this. I sat there in the cab of my truck, watching a hawk circle slow over the tree line across the road, and let him finish before I said a single word. I am not fixing anything, Brett, I said. There was a pause, the sound of him breathing hard on the other end, maybe pacing, maybe standing perfectly still. Dad, please, he said. I am begging you. Everyone is showing up in an hour. Her whole family, my whole side. This is humiliating enough already without the bar running dry in front of 200 people. I want to ask you something, I said. And my own voice sounded strange to me, calm in a way that did not match anything happening in my chest. Do you know what I found at Montford Street this morning? Silence. I found an empty spot on my dining room wall where your mother's paintings used to hang, I said. I found her jewelry box, open and empty. I found my father's chisels gone from the case I built for them. And then I found the receipt, Brett. Blue Ridge Pawn and Loan. $950. Dad, I can explain. He said the words tumbling out fast now, tripping over each other. It was not what it looks like. We were going to buy it all back after the honeymoon, I swear. We just needed cash for some last-minute vendor payments, and Tara said you would not even notice. She said they were just old paintings sitting in a house nobody really looked at anymore. You sold your mother, I said, and my voice cracked on the word mother in a way I had not expected it to. You sold the last physical things I had left of her to pay for flowers at a party where I was not even welcome. Do not you dare try to explain that to me like it is a misunderstanding. He was crying now, the kind of crying that comes out ugly and unpracticed from a grown man who has never had to do it in front of anyone. Dad, please, he said. They are going to throw us out in front of everyone, in front of her whole family. Please. I know, I said. That sounds like a very hard morning for you. Please, he said again, smaller this time, almost a whisper. I am your son. Not today, I said. Today you are a man who has to answer for what he did, the same as anyone else would. I heard him say my name one more time, heard the call drop when I pulled the phone away from my ear and pressed the red button myself, before he could say anything else that might have made this harder than it already needed to be. I sat there for a moment in the quiet cab, looking down at my own hands on the wheel, the same hands that had built the crib he slept in, the desk he studied at, the table his mother had eaten breakfast at for 30 years. I thought about every excuse I had ever made for him, Every time I had told myself he would grow into the man I hoped he could be. If I just gave him a little more room, a little more grace, a little more money. I turned the key. The old engine caught on the second try, rough and honest. Nothing like the hollow hum of the car I had left locked in my garage that morning. I was not driving toward Ravenswood to save my son's wedding. I was not driving there to make peace, or to forgive, or to quietly slip a check into somebody's hand the way I had done so many times before when Brett found himself in trouble he could not talk his way out of. I was going to that wedding. But I was not going as a father anymore. The drive to Ravenswood took 25 minutes. Out past the edge of the city, where the road narrows and climbs through stands of old-growth oak just starting to turn. I did not turn on the radio. I did not rehearse what I was going to say. I have built enough houses in my life to know that the strongest structures are the ones a man does not overthink. The ones that come from something true, settling into its natural shape. I thought about Meg for most of that drive. Not the sickness at the end, but the early years. Back when we had nothing but a rented apartment and a stack of unpaid bills, and each other. She used to say that a man's character shows up clearest in the moments nobody is asking him to perform. I had spent 40 years believing I was building something solid for my son. I was starting to understand, somewhere around mile marker 12, that I had actually been building him a life so soft he had never once had to develop a spine of his own. The estate came into view as the road crested the last hill. White columns rising up out of a sweep of manicured lawn. The kind of building that exists to make ordinary people feel like they have wandered into something out of their own reach. A line of black sedans and rented limousines idled in the circular drive, engines humming, drivers standing beside them in dark suits, checking their phones. I pulled my truck right up behind the last car in line and killed the engine. The tires had picked up mud somewhere along the county road, and there was a dent in the rear bumper from a lumber delivery gone wrong 3 years back. My truck looked exactly like what it was among all that polished chrome. A working man's tool, parked in a place built to make working men feel small. A valet in a burgundy vest came trotting over before I had even gotten both boots on the ground, waving his hands at me like he was trying to shoo off a stray dog that had wandered in from the woods. "Sir, you cannot park here," he said. "This is the reserved arrival zone. Deliveries go around back. The loading dock stays open until 3. I closed the truck door. Not hard. Just enough to hear the click settle into place. "I am not a delivery driver, son," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected, carrying the particular weight that 40 years of giving instructions on job sites tends to put into a man's voice, whether he means it to or not. The kid blinked at me, uncertain now, glancing back toward the entrance, as if hoping someone with more authority would materialize to handle this for him. "Sir, please," he tried again. "We have the Whitman-Ashford wedding starting in less than 30 minutes. If the manager sees a truck parked on the arrival carpet, I am the one who gets written up." I reached into my jacket and pulled out a folded $100 bill, the same denomination I used to hand foremen back when a job needed to move faster than the paperwork allowed. I pressed it into his hand. "If anyone gives you trouble," I said, "you tell them Earl said it was fine. They will know exactly who that means before this morning is over." He looked down at the bill, then up at me, clearly more confused than reassured, but he did not argue further. I turned and started walking toward the massive front doors, my boots loud against stone laid smooth and expensive under 100 years of careful maintenance. I was wearing my one good suit, the charcoal one I had pressed the night before, back when I still thought I might need it for something joyful. My shoes were polished to a shine that caught the morning light with every step. To anyone watching from a distance, I probably looked like any other guest arriving fashionably early. It was only up close that the truth of me became visible. The calluses, the sun-worn skin at my collar, the particular way a man carries himself after 40 years of physical labor that no tailored suit can entirely disguise. A security guard stepped into my path before I reached the door, broad-shouldered, wearing a dark blazer and an earpiece. The kind of man hired specifically to make problems disappear before they ever reach the people who matter. "Can I see your invitation, sir?" he asked, his eyes already moving past me, toward my truck parked crooked on the red carpet behind me. "I do not have one," I said. "I am the father of the groom." The guard's jaw tightened. He looked me over slowly, from my polished shoes to my calloused hands to the truck sitting crooked on the red carpet behind me, and something like a smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. "I have been briefed," he said, dropping the "sir" from his voice entirely now. The bride and groom were very specific this morning. Older man, they said. Disruptive. Told me to keep him out at all costs if he showed up. "So why do not you turn around and get back in that truck before I have to call this in as a trespassing situation?" I laughed, a short, dry sound that surprised even me. "Trespassing," I said. "That is a strange word to use for a man standing outside a building he has already paid $42,000 to rent for the day." His smirk faltered just slightly. Behind him, through the tall glass doors, I could see a man in a gray suit moving briskly across the lobby, a clipboard tucked under one arm. The unmistakable posture of someone whose entire job depended on nothing going wrong before 3 o'clock. "Sinclair," I called out loud enough to carry through the glass. "It is Earl Whitman." The man in gray stopped mid-stride and turned. His eyes found me through the door, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition? Then a flicker of understanding that moved fast across his face like a cloud passing over a field. He had been the one processing my payments for 3 weeks. Every invoice, every deposit, every line item that had built this entire event from nothing. He crossed to the door himself and pulled it open before the guard could say another word. "Mr. Whitman," he said, his voice carefully neutral, in the way people learn to speak when they sense a storm is coming, and have decided their only safe position is somewhere in the middle of it. "We were not expecting you." "I imagine not," I said. He glanced at the guard, then back at me, some silent calculation passing behind his eyes. Whatever conclusion he reached, he did not share it out loud. He simply stepped aside and held the door. The guard opened his mouth to protest, but Sinclair cut him off with a small, tired shake of his head. "Let him through," he said quietly. "Mr. Whitman is the one who signs the checks around here." I walked past the guard without looking at him again. Some men only understand a hierarchy once somebody higher up on it has spoken out loud. The lobby opened into a grand hall, lined with fresh-cut orchids in towering arrangements, the air thick with their sweetness, and the low murmur of a string quartet drifting out from somewhere beyond a set of open double doors. I followed the sound. The ballroom stretched out in front of me, gold light pouring through tall windows onto round tables draped in white linen, crystal glasses catching the sun in 100 small explosions of color. At the far end, a raised stage held 2 chairs and an arch wrapped in more of those same pale orchids. The ceremony had already ended, I realized. This was the reception now, the toasts, the part of the day where a father was supposed to stand and say something true about the son he had raised. I saw Brett first, standing near the head table, in a tuxedo that fit him better than any suit I had ever owned. His face pale, his eyes darting toward the entrance every few seconds, as if some part of him had known this moment was coming. Then I saw Tara beside him, radiant in white silk, a microphone in her hand, mid-toast. Her voice trailing off as the guests nearest the door began to turn and follow her gaze toward the man walking down the center aisle in muddy work boots and a pressed charcoal suit. The string quartet faltered, the notes scattering into an uneven silence. 200 faces turned toward me in a slow ripple that moved through the room like wind through a field of wheat. I did not stop walking. I had spent 40 years learning that the moment you hesitate on a job site is the moment the whole structure starts to lean the wrong way. And I was not about to hesitate now, not after everything this family had already taken from me. Brett stepped forward at the edge of the stage, one hand raised, his voice barely above a whisper, even though the whole room could hear it in that silence. "Dad," he said. "Dad, please, do not do this. We can talk about this later. Just turn around." I kept walking. I reached the base of the small steps leading up to the stage and looked past him, past the flowers, past the pale, frightened face of the girl who had sold my wife's jade bracelet for centerpieces. And I climbed the steps, one at a time, the way I have climbed 100 ladders in my life, steady and unhurried, knowing exactly where my feet needed to land. Tara took a step back, clutching the microphone to her chest, like it might somehow shield her. "Give me the microphone," I said. My voice was not raised. In that dead silence, it did not need to be. Tara's fingers loosened around the microphone one at a time, as if some part of her still believed that holding on to it a moment longer might change what was about to happen. Then she let it go, and I took it, feeling the weight of it settle into my palm like a tool I had never used before, but somehow already knew how to hold. I turned to face the room. 200 strangers stared back at me from their round tables, forks frozen halfway to mouths, champagne flutes suspended mid-toast. The whole gathering caught in that particular silence that falls over a crowd right before they understand they are about to witness something they will talk about for years. I tapped the microphone once. The sound boomed out across the ballroom, rattling faintly against the crystal chandeliers overhead. "Good afternoon," I said. My voice came out steady, deeper than I expected it to, carrying easily to the back of the room the way a foreman's voice learns to carry over the noise of a job site. "I apologize for the interruption. I know you were all enjoying the toasts." Nobody laughed. Nobody moved. "My name is Earl Whitman," I continued. "And contrary to whatever you have just heard whispered around this room, I am not unstable, and I am not dangerous. I am simply a father who was told in a text message sent to him the night before his son's wedding that he was not welcome to attend." A low murmur rippled through the crowd, the sound of 200 people leaning slightly forward all at once. "I was told my hands were the problem," I said, holding them up for the room to see, the calluses and the old scars catching the afternoon light. "I was told that 40 years of working with these hands, building the very kind of furniture some of you are probably sitting on right now in your own homes, would embarrass the family my son was marrying into. I was told I was too blue-collar for this room." I looked directly at the head table where Tara's parents sat frozen, her father's fork still hovering somewhere above his plate. "But here is the interesting part," I said. "Here is the part I think everyone in this room deserves to know. Even though I was not good enough to sit among you today, I was apparently good enough to pay for every single thing you are currently enjoying." I reached into my jacket and pulled out a folded printout, the wire confirmation I had tucked away weeks ago, without quite knowing why I would ever need it. Some old instinct from decades of protecting myself on job sites where handshake deals had a way of turning into disputes. $42,000. I read aloud, unfolding the paper slowly. "Paid to Ravenswood Estate 3 weeks ago by Earl Whitman. That covered this room, the orchids, the string quartet you heard playing when I walked in, the champagne currently going flat in your glasses." I lowered the paper and looked at my son, who stood frozen at the edge of the stage, his face gone the color of old plaster. "You wanted a perfect day, Brett," I said, and my voice did not rise, though something in it had gone harder now, colder, the sound of a man who has finally stopped protecting someone who never protected him back. "You wanted to stand up here and play the part of a man who had arrived, who belonged in a room like this one. But somewhere along the way, you forgot something important. A man does not get to banish the person who built the very foundation he is standing on, and still call himself the one who built it. A woman near the front stood up slightly, phone already rising toward me, the small red recording light blinking. I did not stop her. Let them record it. I had nothing left to hide from anyone in that room. I am a simple man, I said, turning back to face the crowd at large. I have spent my whole life believing that if you build something honestly with your own two hands, and you treat the people around you with respect, that is enough. That is the whole formula. I thought I had taught my son that same lesson. I let the silence stretch a moment before I finished the thought. But it seems I only taught him how to spend what other people build. Somewhere near the back of the room, a chair scraped against the floor. Tara's mother had risen halfway out of her seat, her face gone pale beneath a layer of expertly applied makeup. One hand pressed flat against her chest, as if she already sensed what direction this speech was heading next. I was not finished yet. Not even close. 3 months ago, I continued. My son and his fiancée asked me to sign papers, folding my workshop, my home, and 2 rental properties into something called a family holdings company. They told me it was for tax purposes. They told me it would protect our legacy. What they did not tell me was that buried on page 14 of that agreement was a clause granting my son full control over every asset in that trust. The moment a doctor signed a form saying I was no longer capable of managing my own affairs, the room had gone completely still now. The kind of silence that has weight to it, that presses down on a space full of people who suddenly understand they are not watching a family argument anymore. 3 weeks ago, I said my son offered to drive me to what he called a routine checkup. He had never once offered to drive me to a doctor's appointment in his entire adult life. I did not think much of it at the time. I think about it quite differently now, Dad Brett said, his voice cracking, stepping forward with both hands raised. Dad, it was not like that, I swear. I was just worried about you. I turned toward him slowly. Were you? I asked. Because when I called my attorney this morning after I discovered my late wife's paintings and jewelry missing from the home I gave you, he found something else while reviewing the trust documents. A submission to my bank dated 2 days ago requesting release of supplemental wedding funds, complete with a signature. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out a second folded paper, one Gus had photographed and sent to my phone not 20 minutes earlier, and held it up for the room to see, though nobody but the people closest to the stage could have read the actual words on it. My signature, I said. Except I never signed it. A collective gasp moved through the crowd, sharper this time, more alive than the murmur before it. Somewhere in the back, a man's voice muttered something that sounded like, "Good Lord." That is a federal crime, I said, my voice carrying easily now without any effort at all. Forging a signature on a financial document is not a family disagreement. It is not a misunderstanding between a father and son. It is fraud, plain and documented, and my attorney has already flagged it for the district attorney's office this morning, alongside the theft charges related to my wife's belongings. Brett had gone completely white, swaying slightly on his feet, one hand gripping the back of a nearby chair for balance. I did not do that, he said, his voice barely audible now. I swear to you, Dad, I did not sign anything. I looked at him for a long moment, searching his face for whatever truth might still be living underneath all that panic. And then, almost against my will, my eyes drifted to Tara, standing a few feet away, her jaw tight, her eyes fixed on some point on the floor that suddenly seemed very interesting to her. I turned my attention fully toward her for the first time since taking the stage. You handled the wedding finances, did not you? I said. Every vendor payment, every invoice, every form that needed a signature attached to it. She lifted her chin, some old defiance flickering back into her expression even now. "I do not know what you were talking about," she said, though her voice had lost most of the confidence it carried an hour earlier in my driveway. "I think you do," I said. "I think you have known exactly what you are doing. Since the moment you decided a man who builds furniture with his hands was not worth inviting to his own son's wedding, but was somehow still worth stealing from behind his back." Her mother rose fully out of her seat now, smoothing the front of an expensive dress with hands that were visibly trembling. "This is outrageous," she said, her voice pitched for the whole room to hear. "This man is clearly unwell. Somebody needs to call security and have him removed immediately." I looked at her, at the pearls around her neck, at the confidence she was trying so hard to project, even as her voice wavered on the last word, and I felt something shift inside me. The particular clarity that comes when a man realizes there is one more piece of this puzzle still waiting to be laid out on the table. "Actually," I said, turning to face her directly, since we are on the subject of things people are not telling the truth about. "This afternoon, there is something about your own family I think this room deserves to hear as well." "I did my homework," I said, addressing the room now more than any single person in it. "When my son told me his fiancée came from money, from real established wealth up in Boston, I did what any businessman does before agreeing to hand over his life savings for a wedding. I looked into it." Diane Ashford's face had gone rigid, every carefully maintained muscle in it holding perfectly still, the way a person freezes when they sense a car sliding toward them on ice, and understand there is nothing left to do but wait for the impact. "Preston Ashford." I continued nodding toward the man still seated beside her, his fork finally abandoned on his plate. "Your investment firm filed for reorganization 8 months ago. Your house in Beacon Hill was sold at a loss to cover outstanding debts to 3 separate creditors. The wedding gift you promised my son and his bride, a down payment toward their first home, does not exist in any account I could find, because there is no money left in any account to find." Preston stood up so fast, his chair toppled backward onto the floor with a loud crack that echoed through the silent ballroom. "That is a lie," he said, his voice too loud, too fast, the voice of a man who has spent his whole life talking his way out of rooms exactly like this one. "You have no idea what you are talking about." "I have every idea," I said. "I spent 30 years building a business by knowing exactly who I was dealing with before I signed a single contract. I know a man drowning in debt when I see one. Preston. Because I built houses for plenty of them over the years, right up until the bank came to take the houses back." The room had shifted. Now the horror that had been aimed squarely at me for the last few minutes, swinging slowly around to point somewhere else entirely. And I could feel it happening. The particular energy of 200 strangers realizing the story they thought they understood was not the story at all. "There is one more thing," I said, and I let my voice drop lower now, quieter, the way a man's voice goes quiet right before he says the thing that actually matters. "Yesterday afternoon, a payment of $950 was made in cash to a bridal boutique here in Asheville, covering the final alteration fee on a dress that had not yet been released from the shop." I looked directly at Tara now. Her face had lost all its color, her eyes locked on mine with something close to real fear behind them for the first time all day. "I have a receipt in my pocket from a pawn shop downtown," I said, reaching into my breast pocket and holding it up so the nearest tables could see the pale yellow paper. "Dated yesterday. $950 for 3 watercolor paintings. My late wife spent her whole life creating a set of hand-forged chisels, passed down through 3 generations of my family, and a jade bracelet I gave her on our 10th wedding anniversary, the one she wore every single day for 30 years, until the day she died." A woman near the front pressed a hand to her mouth. Somewhere behind me, I heard someone whisper, "Oh my God," low and horrified. "They sold my wife," I said, and my voice finally broke on that last word. the one I had been holding steady through everything else. They sold the only physical pieces I had left of the woman who raised our son. And they used that money to release a wedding dress from alterations so this day could look perfect for people who cannot even pay their own bills. "Tara," I said, my voice cracking with something raw, now unrehearsed. "You sold 40 years of a marriage for $950, and you spent it on lace." She looked down at her own dress, then at the white silk and hand-stitched beading, as if she were seeing it for the first time, as if the fabric had somehow transformed in front of her into something she could no longer bear to be wearing. "Brett," she whispered, turning toward him. "You knew. You drove me there. You waited outside while I did it." "I did not know you sold the ring," Brett shouted back at her, his voice cracking wide open now, all the polish gone out of it. "You told me it was just old junk. You told me it was safe." "You are a liar," she screamed. "You needed the money just as much as I did." "Enough," I said, and the single word cut through their fighting like a saw blade through green pine. I turned toward the double doors at the back of the ballroom, where I had asked Sinclair quietly before I ever set foot on that stage, to let 2 officers wait just out of sight until I gave the signal. They walked in now, unhurried. Their footsteps the only sound in that entire silent room, and 200 guests parted in front of them like water breaking around stone. The older of the 2 officers, a sergeant with gray at his temples, and the tired, steady eyes of a man who had walked into 100 rooms exactly like this one, stepped up onto the edge of the stage and looked at me first. "Mr. Whitman," he said quietly, "you were the one who filed the complaint this morning." "I am," I said. I handed him the pawn slip and the folded bank form, together, my hand steadier than I expected it to be. "That is the evidence. Grand larceny on the paintings and jewelry. Attempted fraud on the signature. My attorney has already been in contact with your department." The sergeant looked the papers over briefly, then nodded once and turned toward Brett and Tara, who stood frozen at the center of that stage in their wedding clothes, looking suddenly like 2 children caught somewhere they were never supposed to be. "Brett Whitman," he said, his voice carrying easily across the silent ballroom. "Tara Ashford, I need you both to turn around and place your hands behind your back." Tara let out a sound that was not quite a scream, more like the air going out of something all at once. Brett did not move at first, his eyes fixed on me, wide and pleading, in a way that reached down into some old, tired part of my chest, even now. "Dad," he said. "Dad, please. Not like this. Not in front of everyone." I looked at him, at the tuxedo I had unknowingly helped pay for, at the face I had watched grow from an infant into a man I no longer fully recognized. And I did not look away, even though every instinct I had ever carried as his father wanted me to. "I did not do this to you, Brett," I said. "You did this the moment you decided a text message was easier than a phone call, and you kept doing it every hour after that." The younger officer stepped behind him and guided his arms back gently but firmly. The sound of the cuffs clicking shut was small in that enormous room, barely audible over the quiet gasps rippling through the crowd. But it felt to me like the loudest sound I had heard all day. A period at the end of a very long sentence. Tara did not go quietly. She twisted against the sergeant's grip, the train of her dress dragging across the stage floor, tears cutting streaks through her carefully applied makeup. "Daddy," she cried out, toward the table where her parents sat frozen. "Do something! Help me!" Preston Ashford looked at his daughter, then looked at me, then looked down at his own plate and did not stand up. He knew, I think, in that moment, that any move he made now would only draw more attention to a family that had nowhere left to hide. The officers walked them down off the stage, and through the center of the room, the same aisle I had walked up not 15 minutes earlier. The guests parted again, silent this time, nobody quite able to meet the eyes of the bride and groom being led out of their own wedding in handcuffs, instead of walking out arm in arm toward a honeymoon. I stood alone on that stage for a moment after they were gone. The microphone still loose in my hand. The room around me utterly still. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved to comfort anyone. 200 strangers simply sat there, waiting to see what the old man in the muddy boots would do next. I set the microphone down gently on the small table beside the arch of orchids. I looked once more at the empty space where my son had been standing at the pale patch of stage floor, still marked faintly with the shape of two people who no longer belonged in that room. "Sinclair," I said, my voice quiet now, tired in a way that had nothing to do with my legs. "Clear the room. The party is over." He nodded from where he stood near the kitchen doors, already signaling to his staff. I walked down the steps and down the center aisle one final time, past tables of half-eaten food and toppled champagne glasses, past faces I would never see again, and did not particularly want to. I walked through the grand lobby, past the towering orchid arrangements that had cost more than most men's monthly wages, and out through the same heavy doors I had pushed through less than an hour before as an uninvited guest. The valet who had tried to stop me earlier stood frozen near the entrance, still holding the folded $100 bill I had pressed into his hand, watching me with an expression somewhere between fear and awe. I climbed into my truck, still parked crooked across the red carpet, where I had left it, defiant and mud-streaked, among all that polished chrome. I started the engine. It caught, rough and honest, on the first try, the way it always did. I did not look in the rearview mirror as I pulled away. I did not need to. I already knew exactly what I was leaving behind. The fluorescent lights in the visitation room hummed at a pitch that seemed designed to wear a man down, a stark contrast to the string quartet and crystal chandeliers of an hour before. There was no champagne here, no orchids, just gray cinder block walls, a steel table bolted to the floor, and the faint smell of industrial cleaner failing to cover something harder underneath it. I sat on a metal chair with my hands folded on the table, waiting. Gus had met me in the parking lot, quiet and grim, and had gone off to speak with the desk sergeant about paperwork while I sat with my own thoughts in that small, cold room. When the guard finally brought Brett in, I almost did not recognize him. The tuxedo that had looked so sharp on that stage was wrinkled now, the collar unbuttoned, the bow tie gone entirely. His eyes were red and swollen, his face blotchy in a way I had not seen since he was a small boy, scraped raw by some schoolyard disappointment. He shuffled rather than walked, his shoulders curled inward, as if he were trying to make himself small enough to disappear into the gray walls around him. He sat down across from me. The guard looped his cuffed wrist through a metal ring bolted to the table, the small clink of the chain, the only sound in the room for a moment. "Dad," he said, his voice cracking on the single word. "Thank God. Please, you have to get me out of here. There is a guy 2 cells down who will not stop yelling. I cannot stay in there. I cannot." I did not say anything right away. I studied his face, looking for the boy who used to trail me around the workshop with a plastic hammer, asking me to teach him how to build something that would last. I could not find him anymore. Whatever version of that boy remained had been buried under something else, something that had grown quietly for years, while I was too busy loving him to notice. "Dad," he said again, leaning forward as far as the chain would allow, "you have to post bail. Gus said it could be set by tomorrow morning. Just pay it. I will pay you back, I swear. I will get a real job. I will do anything you want. Just please get me out of here." "I am not here to bail you out, Brett," I said. He froze his mouth, still half open, around whatever he had been about to say next. What he whispered. "I am here to say goodbye," I said. "Goodbye," he repeated the word, coming out strange and small. "Dad, what are you talking about? You cannot just leave me here." "I can," I said. And I am going to. But it was not my fault, he blurted, the words tumbling over each other now in a rush of panic. It was Tara, Dad. You know how she is. She was obsessed with the wedding looking perfect. She said you would not even notice the paintings were gone. She said it was just old junk sitting in a house nobody looked at. I tried to stop her, I swear I did, but she would not listen to me. I listened to him throw the woman he had promised to spend his life with under the wheels of his own excuses, not 2 hours after he had stood beside her at an altar, and something in my chest went cold in a way I had not expected. "Stop," I said. He stopped, breathing hard, his chest rising and falling too fast. "Do you hear yourself?" I asked. "You are a 29-year-old man, Brett. A grown man sitting here telling me that a woman made you steal from your own father. You are telling me you have no spine of your own, no will, no honor left to speak of." "I loved her," he said weakly. "You loved the idea of her," I said. "You loved how she made you feel like you belonged somewhere bigger than the workshop you grew up in. And you loved my money because it let you buy that feeling for both of you. But love is not theft, Brett. And a wedding is not a license to steal from the man who raised you alone." He put his face in his cuffed hands and sobbed an ugly, unpracticed sound. The sound of a man who has never once had to cry in front of anyone without an audience to perform for. "I am sorry," he said into his own palms. "I am so sorry, Dad. I messed up. I know I messed up. But prison. I cannot go to prison. I am not built for this." "You are right," I said quietly. "You are not built for it. You are soft, Brett. You always have been. And that is not your fault. That is mine. I paved every road so smooth in front of you that you never once had to learn how to walk on gravel." "Then help me now," he said, looking up, tears cutting fresh tracks down his blotchy face. "Please." "That is exactly why I cannot," I said. "For 29 years, I protected you from every hard edge this world ever tried to put in front of you. I paid your debts. I smoothed over your mistakes before they ever had the chance to teach you anything. And look what it built. It built a man who could stand in a driveway and call his own father the help. It built a man who sold his mother's memory to pay for a dress." "Why do you hate me?" he whispered. "I do not hate you," I said, and my voice cracked, despite every effort I had made all day to keep it steady. "I love you. That is the whole tragedy of this moment, Brett. I love you enough to finally let you fall." I stood up. The chair scraped hard against the concrete floor. "There is no safety net anymore," I said, looking down at him one last time. "No checkbook coming to fix this. There is just you and whatever you decide to build out of what is left." "Dad," he said, his voice breaking, wide open now. "Dad, wait. Please. Do not walk away. I am scared." I stopped with my hand on the door. "You should be scared," I said. "Growing up usually is. But it is the only thing that is ever going to get you through the other side of this." I knocked twice on the heavy steel door. The guard opened it from outside. Behind me, I heard Brett shout my name one last time, his voice cracking into something raw and unguarded. But I walked out into the hallway anyway, and the door swung shut behind me with a heavy metallic sound that cut his voice off clean. I stood there a moment in that gray hallway, listening to the silence that followed. It was heavy. It hurt in a place deeper than I had words for. But underneath the hurt, quiet and steady, it also felt like the first honest thing I had done for my son in a very long time. It took 30 days to scrub the worst of that morning off my life. 30 days of lawyer meetings, signed statements, and a silence in my workshop that I did not know how to name at first. For the first week, I found myself checking my phone every hour out of some old habit, waiting for a call that never came, a text that never buzzed against the workbench. By the second week, I had stopped checking. By the third, I understood that the silence was not emptiness at all. It was peace, the kind I had not felt in longer than I cared to admit. I went back to Blue Ridge Pawn and Loan the Monday after the wedding. The man behind the counter, a heavy-set fellow named Rusty, who had clearly seen the story on the local news, looked at me with a strange mixture of respect and caution when I walked through the door. I set the ticket down on the glass counter, along with a stack of cash. I did not negotiate the interest. I did not argue about the fees. I only wanted what belonged to me. He brought the items out from the back, one at a time. The 3 watercolors, still safe in their frames, the colors as soft and true as the day Meg had painted them. The chisel, set 12 blades my father had forged by hand and passed down to me the year I turned 18. The jade bracelet, small and cool in my palm, exactly as I remembered it. I stood there for a long moment, just holding them, feeling the weight of 40 years settle back into my hands where it belonged. I did not take them home. My house on the ridge had become something close to a museum in the years since Meg passed. Every room arranged around the shape of her absence, and I was tired of living inside a memorial. I took the paintings to a small gallery downtown that specialized in local watercolor artists. The kind of place where her work could hang, where strangers might actually stop and look at it, the way visitors used to in our own hallway. I kept the chisels and the bracelet for myself, the 2 things I was not yet ready to let go of. I sold the house on Montford Street 3 weeks later, not to some investor looking to flip it for profit, but to a young couple, a nurse and a diesel mechanic, who walked through the front door and looked at the place the way people look at something they have been praying for. They did not ask about upgrades. They did not complain about the fixtures. They just stood in that empty dining room, holding hands, quietly discussing where they might put a table of their own one day. I sold it to them for a fraction of what it was worth, simply because I liked the calluses on the young man's hands. When the check cleared, I took every dollar from that sale, along with what the gallery paid out for Meg's paintings, and I opened a new account at the bank downtown. I named it the Margaret Whitman Trade Fund, after a long conversation with Gus about the paperwork, and a longer one with myself about what I actually wanted to leave behind in this world. It would go toward tuition for young people in this county who wanted to learn a trade. Welding, plumbing, carpentry. The kind of skilled work that builds a life a person can be proud of. Standing inside, it felt like the best investment I had ever made. Better than any rental property or furniture showroom I had ever signed my name to. I drove home that evening past the old cotton mill and the coffee shop that used to sell my first set of chisels. And I pulled into my own driveway as the sun was dropping low behind the ridge, painting the whole valley gold the way it does on a clear autumn evening. I walked into my workshop and flipped on the single overhead bulb. The half-finished table from Weaverville still sat waiting on the bench, patient, the way wood always is, in no particular hurry to become anything at all. I ran my hand along its edge, feeling the grain under my palm. And for the first time in a month, I picked up a fresh piece of sandpaper with something that felt unmistakably like hope. I spent the better part of that evening simply running my hands over the wood, not sanding, not measuring, just feeling the grain the way I used to when I was young and still learning what a piece of lumber wanted to become before I ever picked up a tool. The Weaverville table could wait another day. There was something else I needed to build first. Something that had been sitting half-formed in my mind since the moment I signed the papers for the Margaret Whitman Trade Fund. I walked to the back of the workshop where I kept my good walnut, the boards I had been saving for a decade, for a project I never quite let myself start. I ran my hand along the top board, feeling its weight, its history, the way it had sat quietly, waiting for a purpose all these years, the same way I had. I decided that night I would build one more table. Not for a wedding gift this time, and not for a stranger's dining room either. This one would sit right here in my own workshop, long enough for 6 people to work around at once, sturdy enough to hold the weight of clamps and vices and every mistake a beginner's hands might make while learning how to measure twice and cut once. It took me the better part of 2 weeks to build it properly, working slow and deliberate. The way Meg always used to tell me was the only honest way to do anything worth doing. I mortised the joints by hand instead of relying on the pneumatic tools sitting idle on the shelf. I wanted this particular table to remember the labor that went into it, the same way every piece I had ever built for her had remembered mine. While I worked, Gus stopped by most evenings with paperwork for the fund, updates on the case moving slowly through the county courthouse. Brett had accepted a plea agreement 3 weeks in a reduced sentence in exchange for full restitution and mandatory community service. The kind of arrangement Gus assured me was fair, given the circumstances. Tara's family had quietly settled their own charges separately, retreating back to whatever remained of their life in Boston. The wedding itself becoming little more than a cautionary story people whispered about at dinner parties for the rest of that year. I did not feel triumphant when Gus told me the terms. I felt something closer to a tired kind of peace, the sensation of a wound finally closing over, even if the scar underneath would never fully disappear. Word of what happened at Ravenswood traveled faster through this county than I expected it to. For a while, I could not walk into the hardware store or the diner downtown without someone recognizing my face from a video that had apparently made its way around the internet, filmed by some guest with a phone during those final minutes on that stage. Most people were kind about it, nodding at me with a quiet respect I was not used to receiving. A few even shaking my hand and telling me their own stories about children who had grown careless with what they were given. A handful were less generous, muttering that a father should never air his family's business in front of strangers, that some things belonged behind closed doors, no matter how deep the wound. I did not argue with either group. I had made my peace with what I did in that ballroom long before anyone else weighed in on it. I finished the table on a Thursday afternoon in early November, the light coming in gold and low through the workshop windows the way it always did that time of year. I ran a final coat of oil across the surface and stood back to look at it. 6 chairs pulled up around a table built to outlast every hand that would ever rest on it. The first student arrived the following Monday morning, a 19-year-old boy named Miguel, who had grown up 2 hollows over from mine, the son of a roofer who had died the year before in a fall nobody had bothered to prevent with the right safety equipment. Miguel had a quiet, careful way about him that reminded me more than I expected it to of myself at that age. Hungry to learn something real with his hands, but unsure anyone would ever bother teaching him properly. I showed him how to hold a chisel that morning, the same way my own father had shown me 60 years earlier, in a workshop not much different from this one. I watched his fingers wrap around the handle, clumsy at first, the way every beginner's hands are clumsy before the muscle memory settles in. You are going to mess up plenty before you get this right, I told him. That is not failure, son. That is just the price of learning something worth knowing. He nodded, serious, in the way only 19-year-olds trying hard to seem older can be, and set the blade against the wood the way I had shown him. By the following spring, 3 more names had joined Miguel around that table. 2 young women and another boy from the far side of the county. All of them referred through the fund's small application that Gus had helped me draft. All of them hungry for the same thing I had been hungry for at their age. A chance to build something with their own 2 hands and know it belonged to them entirely. I taught them the way my own father had taught me, slow and patient, correcting a grip here, a stance there, never raising my voice over a mistake, because I had learned a long time ago that fear teaches a man nothing worth keeping. I stood there watching Miguel work that first morning, feeling something settle into place inside my chest that I had not felt in longer than I cared to count. For most of my life, I had believed that loving my son meant giving him everything I never had. The soft hands, the easy path, a life free of the calluses and worry that had defined my own. I understand now that, in trying to spare him every hard edge of this world, I only succeeded in raising a man who could not handle the first real storm that ever came his way. True wealth, I have come to believe, is not the number sitting in a bank account, or the label stitched inside a suit. It is the ability to look at your own two hands at the end of a long day and know without question that you earned everything resting inside them. It is teaching a young man like Miguel that dignity is not inherited and it is not purchased. It is built one honest choice at a time, the same way you build anything worth keeping. I think about Meg often in that workshop now, more than I have allowed myself to in years. I think she would have liked watching Miguel learn to hold that chisel properly. I think she would have liked knowing her name sits on a fund that sends kids like him to trade school instead of gathering dust in a bank account nobody ever puts to good use. Brett writes to me sometimes now, short letters from the facility where he is finishing out his sentence, working construction crews for the county in exchange for time off his term. His handwriting has changed. It is steadier now, less like the scrawl of a boy rushing to finish his homework, and more like the deliberate hand of someone learning, slowly and painfully, how to build something worth having. I have not decided yet whether I will answer those letters, or when, or what I might say if I do. Some things a man has to work out entirely on his own before anyone else gets to weigh in on them. And I suspect that is true for both of us right now. For now I have this workshop. I have 6 chairs around a table built to outlast me, and a young man across from me, learning one careful cut at a time how to become the kind of person whose word and whose hands can be trusted in equal measure. We spend our whole lives trying to give our children everything we never had. But somewhere in all that giving, it is easy to forget the one thing that actually matters: character. The kind that only ever grows from having to earn something yourself. I thought loving my son meant shielding him from every storm. I only succeeded in raising a man who had never once learned how to stand in the rain. Never let anyone, not even the family you built with your own 2 hands, treat you like a resource instead of a person. Dignity is the only currency that never loses its value. And sometimes, a man has to be willing to lose everything else just to hold on to it. I picked up a fresh chisel and set it against the edge of a new board. Miguel watching closely from across the table, and somewhere behind me, in the quiet hum of an old workshop, finally full of purpose again. I could have sworn I heard the faint, familiar sound of a woman's laughter. School was back in session. If you believe I did right by letting my son face what he earned, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories like this one. And tell me in the comments, would you have done the same? Or would you have paid the bill one more time?